welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your co-host Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, this time we are back in the studio, not outside, because as things often happen in the colder months of the year where we live, it can go from comfortable in the evening to absolutely frigid. And that's where we are this evening. So I really enjoyed our outdoor session. We had, as far as I could tell, we didn't have a single complaint about the outdoor ambient noise this time, which I was very pleased with. That conversation was really meaningful to me, and I enjoyed the reactions that we got from the listeners. So what did you think about that one, and how are things going?
Yeah, things are going great, thanks. And on that recording, yeah, I agree. I didn't notice a single negative one. And I think the crackling of the fire came in just at sort of the right level to make people feel the ambiance without it being overwhelming. And the siren was the only sort of like outlier, but that kind of, worked in thematically to what was being discussed at the time. And it was a great experience. And like you said, we went from last week having, unusually warm, like mid 70s only a few days ago, to now dipping below freezing at night. So definitely good to be back in the studio. And I have a candle lit, at least in
there we go. Yes,
in dedication to our fire from last time.
An open flame is a requirement. Yeah, that's good.
Right.
Well, this is episode 18. It's hard to believe, but we're also coming up toward the end of the year, first year of the show. And it's been quite a journey. This evening, we wanted to spend some time going through some questions from our listeners related to your most recent Point of Convergence episode, as well as some other things that we've been talking about on Liminal Frames. And so the structure of tonight's show is going to be going through some of those listener questions, giving Darren a chance to provide some input, but also I'll have a chance to kind of ask my own questions and opine as well. So I'm looking forward to this. We haven't quite done one quite like this, and I think it will be a good time. So to start off with this episode, we're going to focus on a question related to space-time. And the question specifically is, can you elaborate more on time being parallel? Of course, they said perhaps a visual, such as a flowchart, which maybe we can work on offline. I personally have considered time to be an infinite number of timelines, every possibility existing all at the same time, constantly flowing, and all points connected via consciousness. However, my understanding / theory is probably not correct. Can you elaborate?
I can, and I will. So I would say a couple things on this. One sort of way I sort of communicated to people to think about this was when you drop a rock in a pond, right? What happens is, and sort of picture the left and the right of the rock being the past and the future, right? Metaphorically. But when you drop a rock into the pond, especially a large rock, you'll see ripples go in all directions equally, equidistant, kind of spiraling out from the center. And I think this is similar. And so there are times where, for instance, really impacting events from the future are so impacting that they send these kind of waves that also end up filtering into our present. And there's been some interesting historical data on this, even around, for instance, when a major historical event like 9/11 happened. All these random number generators that are sort of always online and sort of testing for this stuff had jumps like the day before, kind of thing, 9/11. So it's like something is arriving from the future, that kind of, ripple effect, and something in our consciousness, mostly subconsciously, right, is picking it up. And this is actually registering on something like the random number generator, which is being impacted by consciousness waves, basically. And if you remember when I talked about my experience at Monroe, when we were actually joining together in a coherent field, literally field in terms of being out in the field, but also a coherent resonant field in preparation for our C5/Heist experience, we also had one of the staff at Monroe was running a random number generator experiment up on the side of the mountain. And sure enough, there was this spike right around the time, not just that we saw phenomena manifest in the sky, but also at the time when we started sort of putting together this coherent field, right? Really being concentrated together and developing this coherent field. So that's the first thing I would say is that I know this is confusing to people because we're used to walking through time in a linear fashion, right? And it never goes reverse as far as we experience it usually, right? But actually, that's not the way time really is. And that's the first example I would give. The second one I would give when he asked for some sort of illustration or some sort of diagram is I would describe it more like a tapestry. So when you think about a tapestry, you can, if you were like get a microscope, you can zoom down and see like threads, right down to a thread on this huge tapestry, right? And the threads are in multiple directions, right? To sort of like really create a strong fabric, right? That is sort of woven together. And I would say like our timeline is one of those threads. And there's threads running parallel, there's threads that are running against it diagonally, right? And this is reality. And even when we look at like on the quantum kind of scale, understanding how physicists think about time, they think about this kind of block space time, that it basically exists as it fully is, finally finished kind of thing, all space, all time, right? And that's from physics. That's not like just a bunch of woo people sitting around a fire saying, "Why don't you think the universe is this way?" This is what physicists are saying. So everything's pointing in this direction. And I think this is one thing people do need to be aware of, even if you're more of a nuts and bolts type, is that all of the cutting edge physics is pointing in these really exotic directions. But that's the way to think about it. And I would say that even when you think about that question, right, you sort of, you pick this apart. And I talked about this in my presentation in New York. Nothing in the English language prevents us from asking questions that sound legitimate. But when you really pull apart the question, you realize this is a nonsensical question, not because the person wasn't thinking it through, but because we are betrayed by the way we think about time. And so we can't even, and our language is also built around our usual default experience of time. So even our language makes it almost impossible to construct this in a meaningful way. And because it's, number one, embedded in our language, which reflects our thought process, it makes it impossible for us to really understand that what we're asking is a non-coherent question. Because if you'll notice in there, he talked about, is time like this as we walk through time? And then so it's sort of like trying to talk about the very thing you want to pull apart, but doing it with some assumptions baked in, basically. So that's what I would say about that too. All I can say is, again, cutting edge physics is pointing in these exotic directions. Time is not what we think it is. Einstein famously said, it's a way we think. It's not really a mode in which we live. And when you've had some of these experiences like I've had, when you're kind of in these alternate realms, you have then the contrasting experience of feeling that time doesn't work that way. You're either completely outside of time or you're in a kind of time that's different than what we walk in here. And that makes a big difference, because then it goes beyond concepts. At that point, you have like a felt understanding of what it's like. So that's what I would say to people. Even when we talk about past lives, it gets really tricky, right? Because again, you heard what I said there, past lives, right? So we're taking this thing, we're baking it into this linear thing, like, because we assume a lifetime marches progressively forward, one direction, right? Unidirectional. So therefore, if I've had other lifetimes, they must have been before or after. But that's really not what cutting edge physics is pointing towards either, nor is it really what most metaphysical conceptions point towards either. That it may be that all of these things are happening, and here I'm going to go again, say at the same time. But again, you can see how I'm baked into that language again. So this is what we're kind of getting at. The bottom line is, our experience here is of linear time most of the time. And I think we need to understand that with many of these matters, there's a difference between our experience of something and the way it really is. Even when we have a major breakthrough in understanding and some of the epiphanies I've had, I guarantee you it's still partial, because it's still based on the way my consciousness is formed right now, and how my consciousness can make sense of this kind of information. That puts limitations on it. There are going to be beings that are at a much higher level of consciousness that can understand a much broader perspective than I can. That's just always part of the situation. The same way that the kind of programs you could run on a computer, an Atari computer in the 1980s, is, pales in comparison to what you can run today. It's kind of like that. Is it partially true? Absolutely. Did it work? Yes. Was it a valid experience of playing a video game, playing Pac-Man in 1986? Yes. Is that like a VR game today? No. So it's both and. There's a difference between what we experience versus what the way things really are. And no matter what we're experiencing, it's always going to be partial based on this understanding of this spiral of consciousness.
That leads me to a question I'd like you to speak to, and that is the issue of causality. So, how do you think of causality and determinism, free will, in this kind of conception? I think a lot of folks are going to have concerns about that. Do I have freedom of choice? And it sounds in a way like maybe I don't. Like it's all happening at once, and so I'm not really making a decision. Like, how do you think of that in this cosmology?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think you're right that that's often where people go. And I want to again say a couple things. One, about the way that physics understands that now. One of the implications of quantum theory was that determinism kind of went out the door, right? Which is was so core to our understanding of reality prior to then, right? So it's remarkable when you think back to the fact that only about 100 years ago, our understanding took a while to sort of really kick in, but our understanding of the very way reality works fundamentally shifted once quantum experiments came online. It went from this understanding that there's cause and effect, right? A leads to B leads to C, and never the other way around, to then suddenly realizing that it's more like at the quantum level, every possible way forward is traced out as a probability, right? So you have this range of probabilities, and then the most efficient one was chosen. So that, as opposed to cause and effect. So it looks like cause and effect. So this is another perfect example that relates to what we just finished talking about, where in our experience, it sure looks like I kicked over the thing and it fell over and spilt the milk, right? So it looks like that's exactly what happened. That's our experience of it. That's a completely valid way of saying our experience is accurately described by that scenario. But actually, what's going on behind the scenes on the quantum scale is very, very different. So that's the first thing I would say, is that, again, this is not woo, this is not crazy metaphysics. I'm saying physics already, conventional physics understands this. Determinism is kind of out the door, not to mention local realism and all this other crazy implications. But importantly, again, I would say differentiate between our experience of something or how it looks to us versus the way it really is. Even if you could describe space-time as this kind of block where all space and time is in a finished state, right? Our experience is not like that. We are one of the characters in the movie, even if the movie is completely finished, right? So in one hand, you can say some being from a certain perspective at a high enough dimensional level can see the whole movie finished. If they want, they can run the final few frames. That's not our experience, though. We're one of the characters in the film running it through and experiencing the energetic wavelengths emotionally as we go through it in what feels like real time. And that makes it valid. So it doesn't matter that there's some way of seeing it differently, because our experience is almost always this kind of linear, I make decisions and then I experience consequences kind of thing. And I think that's kind of the way the VR setup has been put together, so to speak, so that we do have precisely that experience, so that we can learn through trial and error. And that's kind of how it's set up, even if it's not ultimately the way things really are.
Got it. So it's in a way it's kind of illusory, but with a purpose. Um, the other thing that I guess came to mind is this notion of like superposition. Is it conceivable that this? I know this can kind of dip into the multiverse concept, which I don't think we're espousing here, but where multiple decision paths are not just available in terms, and one is chosen, but all can be chosen. Like, is it can it run forwards and backwards, and new outcomes basically be produced.
Yes, and I think that again is going to be trippy to some people, but again, there's actually evidence for this. It's called retrocausation, right? It's this notion that not only do we have precognition, where people know the future ahead of time, but we have retrocausation, where the future seems to change the past, or where our present could change the past. But this gets really trippy to talk about, and it's fun to talk about, but it's good to remember that it's like levels of a simulation. I don't literally mean a simulation in terms of some alien set up a computer program and we're just avatars in it. I mean that every layer of reality, regardless of what dimensional sort of scale you're at, is to some degree illusory, right? Because everything's ultimately one, everything's connected to consciousness, and it's just a manifestation of that consciousness, right? So we'll come back to this probably a few times in this program because it is tricky to get to wrap your head around it. But the more and more you can come back to that of, there is oneness and everything is an expression of that oneness ultimately. When you think about things in that way, and so whenever you ask any of these questions, to ask yourself, how does that come back to the sense of oneness, to non-duality, right? How does that change how I think about this? So yeah, it's complex stuff, but I think again the key is that it is illusory in the sense that it's not fundamentally real, right? It's not base reality, but it nevertheless is something we're meant to experience, and we're meant to have the illusion of time and space, because that becomes the stage in which Shakespeare can write the play that the actors sort of walk upon the stage and make decisions and walk through these sets and learn and that kind of thing, right? So it's like that, but it's meaningful even if it's not literally true.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good segue into the next question, which is about non-duality. This question is, if all consciousness is coming from the one source, how is it that someone else's consciousness can be more immature than somebody else's? In other words, why don't we all have the same sort of conscious experience?
Okay, so for a fun experiment, why don't I throw that back at you? And what would you say to that question?
Well, my understanding of this is that the singular source of consciousness, that oneness, it requires experience. And to have experience, it must be in relationship with something that is different than itself. And so to accomplish that, it, kind of, you can come up with a lot of different words here, dissolves or fragments or broken into smaller constituent pieces. And those pieces each have experience, a conscious awareness that is distinct and different. And that distinction and that difference is important because in that difference, there is relational meaning, there is novel experience. If everything is still the same, then no novelty exists. It is all that singularity, that oneness. So that explains why we have some individual conscious agents who have a lower degree or a lesser degree of awareness than others. And here we can talk about, down to the smallest constituent, conscious agents, maybe even to the, atomic or subatomic level. And then you can go to the higher levels that human beings have a higher degree of conscious awareness than the atoms do. We're in relationship with one another. That dynamic is what generates meaning and value, and that is sort of one of the fundamental aims of the one consciousness itself.
Right. Absolutely. So it's this notion that in order for the one consciousness, like the cosmic intelligence, right, or God, if you can handle it without the baggage, um, to bring in new information, it sort of voluntarily goes through this forgetting process, right? Forgets that it's the one consciousness. disassociates, to use a Bernardo Kastrup kind of metaphor. And the same way that you can actually have an individual human being who actually can have multiple alternate personalities coexisting in their mind, right? Who literally have a different experience of life. Like I mentioned before in this podcast, one can be an atheist, another one can be a strong religious believer in the same mind, right? Sometimes one will have allergies that the other one won't have. I mean, quite literally. This just shows you how we have evidence for this already. Same body, right? And yet somehow this person's mind experience, right? Again, think about illusory, right? Think about a projection. That projection in its fullness is creating allergic reactions in the body, which is the same body that a different alter within that mind does not have those allergic reactions, which again shows you how there's kind of a consciousness aspect behind the body mind aspect, right? So in the same way, the one cosmic intelligence disassociates into new alters that experience novel experience, right? They experience the world or the universe in new ways, and with their free will, make decisions that would have been different than what the original cosmic intelligence would have done, which create new feedback, new data, new lessons that ultimately again get contributed back to that one source, right? When we reincarnate, that kind of thing, right? It all gets contributed back. And then in a very real way, and someone actually just tweeted this to me and they asked, is it kind of like that's the evolution of God? And I said, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. That by that process happening over and over again, you actually have the cosmic intelligence itself evolving as part of the system. Um, and in terms of why some are further along than others, that's complex. Number one, because you don't always run at the same speed. You don't always run in one direction. There's times where people will actually regress. If they're at a really one thing that happens when people incarnate into this particular iteration, they often will come in with a certain lessons they need to learn. I call it this energetic waveform that wants to resolve itself. That's unique to every single one of us. That we then contribute that back to the totality. But some people get so caught up in the denseness of this experience that they never sort of wake up to that larger purpose, and they get completely fooled by the illusion. They convince themselves that the illusion is ultimate reality. They think that the things that matter to them that they worry about in this lifetime is all there is. They start believing the sort of reductionistic materialist, message that, you're a slab of meat that when it's done, it just dissolves in the ground. There's nothing more to you. When you believe that, it's going to very much change the way you make decisions, and it can actually make your consciousness regress. You can actually go backwards. And when any soul sort of incarnates, that's always a risk. You kind of, on the one hand, want to create some resistance, right, in incarnation that will make you grow, right, that you can then contribute back to the whole. But if you have too much resistance, you can actually forget who you really are or never wake up to it. And then you can actually regress. So there's that. That's partly explains why people are at different points. Also, as every alter sort of splits off from the original central intelligence, that happens over and over and over again. So you have sort of layers of reality going on, right? Again, you could almost use simulation as a kind of analogy there. So one alter that's like 19, disassociations from the original, then also has disassociations. So one person on the earth might be a 19th level disassociation, where someone else might be like a 15th level, right? Because to add a bit more complexity to it, I'm not trying to overwhelm people here, but there's, in my experience of understanding this stuff with some of the downloads I've had, this is what comes up is that, and I've kind of hinted at this in those 8 new cosmology kind of tweets I made. One is that there's different constitutional backgrounds amongst the people that are walking the planet today. So not everybody only has Earth human arising from, apes kind of thing as part of their background. Some people have other kinds of beings in their background in other kinds of incarnations, and that changes where they are in terms of this process, the spiraling of consciousness. So you can see how it gets complex pretty quickly. But when people talk about it's weird. People call me an old soul, right? And as I've become an adult, I realize my parents in some ways are fairly young souls. That's kind of what they're talking about. Obviously, they don't mean that they've lived longer than their parents in this iteration. They haven't. But what they mean is that deep wisdom that is the part of us that does carry over between each iteration, that is not about knowledge necessarily. It's not necessarily knowing I was Cleopatra or, Genghis Khan in a previous lifetime, but something about this underlying principled understanding of wisdom that you carry with you. Some people have that in droves, some people not so much. And that usually um, goes back to how many iterations they've been through and or what kind of iterations they've been through.
It's an excellent explanation. I love this concept. I love thinking about it. Uh, I think also we've discussed the sort of multi-layer components of it, that not only can you have individuals with sort of different layers of separation from the single consciousness, but even conscious agents can be aggregated, just as we are aggregates of our cells in our bodies. We don't have the experience. I don't have the experience of a single cell that is in my body, but it is a part of me. And so, just as that is true, it is also true that there are sort of larger, for lack of a better term, conscious agents of which we are constituent pieces. And so they have their own energetic expression and behavior and awareness that is larger than what our experience happens to be. And we are all on a journey expressing and climbing, to use another sort of way to think of it, a ladder of conscious development. And that ladder we can go up a rung and down a rung, and then there are probably ladders to each side of us as well.
That's a great point. And I think, again, I try not to overwhelm people, because sometimes they'll be like, can you answer this question? And instead I sort of point them in the direction of 5 new questions, or 5 new matters to bring into consideration as a variable. But you hit on right there a major one. And that is that sometimes people will write me and say, so that's great that you have these downloads, but how do you know it's not from your higher self? And I'll say, absolutely, some of the bit is from my higher self. But importantly, some of my higher self is no longer just a single entity. And I kind of touched on this in the podcast episode on the weekend, that part of what I enter into in sort of this alternate realm is this experience of a kind of a planetary consciousness where it's a plurality, right? And it feels very, very different than this experience. But I still have a feeling of I, right? I am, right? I still have that I amness experience, but it's very, very different. Um, so, but yeah, and what's really interesting about this is that it fits very much with even Donald Hoffman's work, right? And you kind of pointed at that when you said conscious agent, which is his term, that when you look at the math of it, you can break it down to, one small entity, having a conscious experience. But then when you have an interaction between two of those, it creates a new conscious agent, right? And you can keep scaling that all the way up to back to oneness again, where when you combine all of us, we also, even in the math, it works, right? According to this theorem, that you then get this one really intricate quilt-like pattern again, which is has amongst its constitution all of the conscious agents in the cosmos. Yeah.
Fantastic. We could spend the rest of the show on that one concept,
Mm-hmm.
but we won't. We're going to keep going. A lot of other questions to cover here. So this one is going to get a lot more specific to something that's taken place over the last year in your life. And so this person is wanting to know, what is Darren's take on the Chris Bledsoe story, now that Darren has come away from a year of directly experiencing the phenomenon in Chris's vicinity and his social circle.
Right. So to give people a bit of context there, some people will know this, some won't, that I took part in this retreat at the Monroe Institute back in, when was it, May, I think, somewhere around there. And Chris was one of the people there. A few other people, John Alexander and Sean Esborn Hargens, and my friend, well, several people were there. Sean Cahill, some other people too. Um, but as we've talked about before in this show, and as Joseph Burks has mentioned, if you want to have an experience of CE5 or HEIS, your chances go up a lot if you are around a prime experiencer. These are people who, since they're young, have had kind of a magnetic interaction with some aspects of the phenomenon, and often things will manifest in their presence. That doesn't always hold true. There's sometimes where a certain period of life kicks in and it no longer happens, and I think for some people that can be difficult. I won't name names, but in my case, I went to the Monroe Institute and had never, while I had seen some things in my life, I'd never sort of had a direct, intentional, CE5 proactive, let's make it happen now, or let's try to make it happen. Let's try to make contact and see if we have an experience. And that happened. We saw several things that happened over the several nights of that retreat. And I have no doubt that there was a really strong, coherent field amongst the group itself. There was this resonant field, which is really essential. But I'm sure that Chris being there was a big part of that as well. So I'm really thankful to have been a part of that. And I also had an experience at Chris Bledsoe's house a couple months after that. So in the summertime, I was there and had some even more amazing things show up in the sky. So as I said in the podcast episode, that helped really ground into my knowledge base that this is just something that happens. This is part of our reality. There's no question mark at that point. So that definitely helped to open a channel and to ground the channel, and when I think about, Chris's experience, I would definitely say that he's one of the most well-known experiencers because he's had so much happen in his lifetime. And there's been so many people, including credible witnesses, government people and whatnot, that have flocked to him and also had experiences. So I became yet another one of these people who have been in his presence while this is happening, right? And then often, as happens with kind of this hitchhiker effect, you carry it home. So, I remember even Bob McGuire said to me, if you go to Chris's house, be prepared for some hitchhikers, and that's kind of what happened, right? So a lot of this stuff, this really clear channel of communication began at Monroe and then just got stronger after that. So that definitely seems to have been the case. And so I look at Chris's experience, and I always believed him even before I had met him, and before I had experiences. There's no doubt that it's a famous case for a good reason, and not just because of what he's seen, but because all of pretty much every alphabet agency you can think of has also pursued his case because they know it's legitimate and it's happening. So it's a fascinating case, and I'm just thankful that our paths crossed at one point, and it sort of changed the course of my life in some ways.
Yeah, and I would wonder too if what you would say to this. Do you think that Chris's experience and maybe even to a certain degree his presence acts as a kind of catalyst for others? And I think it's a good example where that we use the term hitchhiker effect as a very negative kind of thing, but there's this sort of sense in which prime contactees and exposure to them or connection to them can catalyze experience in other individuals. But I think an important point to make as well is that experience isn't the same. It's not like you're just cloning, Chris
Right.
Bledsoe's experience and you're having the same Chris Bledsoe experience. You're having your own experience that is contextualized in your, your lived embodiment, right? So how do you think about that, and what does that say to you about kind of what's happening at the lower levels here?
That's a great question. I think that's a really worthy follow up because it's an important distinction to make. So, for instance, while my contact experiences definitely increased after having met Chris and after having been at Monroe, I would also point out, as I did in the podcast, that I had had some experiences prior to that, including an experience of contact via meditation that happened like around 2010, and a protocol that was suggested to me then that I have followed ever since then. But to your point, yeah, I mean, for me, while I've had these really profound experiences with these intelligences that provide me information, I, for instance, haven't seen the lady, right? That's not been part of my experience, where it's been a pretty central one of Chris's. So that raises some interesting questions. I think that, again, tying this back to what we said earlier, some of what we are interacting with when we do have this part of us come online that was dormant before is familial lines that go back even before this lifetime. So one of the things that happened to me, and you hear about this in experiencer accounts, right? That people go from sometimes experiencing ontological shock, and this wouldn't be a proper episode of Liminal Frames if we didn't say ontological shock at least once. Um, uh,
Exactly.
but they go from that initial ontological shock to sometimes having the very other end of the spectrum where they go, oh, not only do I know these beings, but I knew them from before I even came into this lifetime, and I have a deep affection for them, stronger than anything else I feel here. Almost like a near-death experience where they say it's now hard to come back into my earthly, manifestation. So I think partly what happens is we are reconnected with, some of us anyway, are reconnected with these lineages that go beyond this iteration. So for me, that's definitely what I felt. And it's hard to, if people were to say, how do you know? It's just this deep, direct knowing. It's like a gnosis. It's not, I built a bunch of concepts and got convinced by some arguments. It's just like this, it through and through, just like when you love your kids, and it's just like you don't have to build up an argument to yourself, right? It's just like it's in your skin and bones and
Some
soul,
days I do, Darren. Some days I have to
right?
build the argument. Yeah.
So it's like that. It's like that feeling of like, wow, of course, these ones, I know these ones, and I've known them from before I can remember my first day on the planet. So it's something like that. It could be that something gets flipped online, like some sort of switch gets flipped that's maybe dormant in many, many of us, if not all of us. And then what you experience is this broader reality that's part of your history. And when I say history, again, tricky, we're getting into time again, right? Because when I go into these alternate experiences, that experience of that collective consciousness seems to be running in parallel to this one. It's like I can jump back and forth between them. So it's not like that happened many, many eons ago, and now here I am as an earth manifestation. I'm saying that they, in some ways, you can think about it as running in parallel and impact each other, right? So I'll have experiences there, quote unquote, there, come back here, and it'll change how I make decisions here, right? So it's a fascinating interplay, and it just shows you how many variables are in play here. But I think that's part of it, is that we won't necessarily experience the same phenomena or even the same beings because, again, we have different lineages. That's part of it.
Love that explanation. Thank you. Well, we're going to shift gears into several questions related to meditation. This came up quite often. So we'll start with this one. I can relate to this. I'm sure many people can. This question is, I have trouble with meditation, but I get liminal state impressions with some sense of oniric versus other and occasional, very unstatistical synchronicity. How can I amplify the signal?
Well, I'd say a couple things there. The first thing I want to say, not to be annoying to people, but I really want to say don't give up too quickly on meditation, because it's been so central to my experience, but to so many people's experience over history. And again, even going back to the beginning of CE5, right, and even the Rama movement in South America, meditation was a big part of that. Even prime experiencers often are uncannily encouraged to learn meditation techniques when they're adolescents, right? Which is almost like a calling card from these other intelligences saying, this is a modality by which we can communicate with you. So I wouldn't want people to too quickly dismiss it or look for another alternative, because we have all sorts of evidence, not just from people via meditation, getting in contact with ascended masters and spiritual traditions and that kind of thing, or saints, right, from history, but also these non-human intelligences as well. And not just that, but it opens you up to and makes part of your real lived embodied experience an experience of non-duality. Like, you'll hear me talk about non-duality so much because it's so central to understanding this, to this cosmology. So that's one thing meditation really does for you, is that if you go deep enough, you end up experiencing reality that way. You have a non-dual realization, and it changes everything. In a really practical way, it makes life much less worrisome because you realize this is to some degree an illusory kind of experience, and that anything really real at that non-dual, everything's connected, can never die because it never came into existence and never goes out of existence. And so it makes you sort of relax into it and go, wow, I might as well just enjoy these simulation rides, these different illusory manifestations that are part of the lessons I learned, because there's nothing I can lose. All I have is here is to gain. And I can only lose in the short term if I get caught up in the illusory nature of it and believe it, start believing the hype rather than realizing what it is and what it's there for. So that's the first thing I want to say. The other thing I would say in terms of what else someone could do, it's really about trying to take our default mode offline, right? So, and when I say default mode, I mean in the modern world, in Western civilization, we are constantly thinking. We have what's called the monkey mind constantly going, even when it serves no real purpose. We can be lying in our beds at night wanting to fall asleep, and yet we're worrying about something that's come up. Somebody didn't respond well to something we did, and we wonder, what could I have done different? Or we're worried about some meeting we're going to have 2 days in the future, or we're worried about something that might or might not happen, like 10 years into the future, right? We have this capacity we developed evolutionarily, but now it's gotten to the point where it's like a train running out of control and we can't stop it, right? And again, I would encourage that with meditation, it's the best way I know how to actually take that default mode offline. And then you suddenly experience so much more of reality. So much of this is about getting out of our own way. This inheritance, this broader reality is there already. It's all around you and it's all within you, right? The universe is within you in a very literal way. And it's really about all of the stuff that's blocking our line of vision because it's part of the monkey mind. It's not like things aren't there. They're there. They're just getting blocked. Your awareness of them is being blocked by these other things. So that's where signal boost gets tricky, right? Because it's not just about signal boost. It's about first getting the garbage out of the way. And I'm not trying to belittle our lives. Like, sometimes we have real concerns we need to think about. But oftentimes, I think everyone here will relate to this. There's times where we worry about things or think about things we wish we had done differently 10 years ago, or, we're thinking about the future, what's going to happen when this happens. And many, many times the things we worry about never even end up manifesting, right? And so all of that was sort of like wasted experience. So again, it's not so much about signal boost as it's about getting out of our own way, so then we can then drop into this larger reality, which is very subtle, right? And so you need to have a clean space. I mean, experientially, right? You need to have a clean space so that you can then tune into these really subtle differences of what's there, right? But that said, if you were going to try some things, lucid dreaming is a great technique you can use. I've talked before on social media about, I use this supplement called galantamine. And what I do there is I kind of do a combination of a bit of meditation, but someone can probably do it without meditation. But what I basically do is wake up at 4 a.m., set an intention, try to resolve any kind of negative energy I tune into, because if I don't resolve that energy, it's likely to manifest in a dream. I want to get, transmute that negative energy, be positive going in, have an intention for what I want to learn. You can even posit a question to the universe or to your guides or whatever way you want to communicate with this broader reality. And then you go in and go back to sleep after I take 2 of these tablets, right, of these galantamine tablets. And then you'll have really, really vivid dreams, and you'll have messages coming up from your subconscious. But I want to make the point here that subconscious doesn't just mean, the part of you in this finite body mind that you're not usually in contact with. I mean it in the Jungian sense, like the collective unconscious. I use this analogy, I think, in the podcast, where we're like these mountaintop peaks, right? We experience life as Mount Everest, right? We have the illusory nature that, or an illusory sense that that's all we are, is Mount Everest sticking up above the clouds, right? But actually, Mount Everest and the bedrock joins with the rest of the Alps, right? And then below that joins with like the continental plates, right? So all of us are like those continental plates, right? So beneath this, what we see on the top layer, there's this connected, consciousness bedrock, which goes beyond just humanity. It connects to everything, absolutely goes back to everything, to that oneness again. We're back at non-duality again. And the more you open yourself to that, the more you can begin to receive messages from there. And that includes other beings, because again, it's all connected, right? It's all part of the oneness. So all of that opens up. You get messages from your higher self, from your deeper self, from a sense of a selfhood that is a collection of conscious agents. And then, even beyond that, other beings that you're connected to. So that's another one. I would also say, for those people who want to roll this direction, psychedelics are another way that you can really take the default mode offline. And then have experiences of broader reality. That's been shown to be the case. That whereas again, reductionistic materialism would have you believe that if really consciousness is in the brain, produced by the brain, then when people are having these mind-blowing experiences on psychedelics, we should see the brain lighting up, right? The gray matter of the brain should be lighting up. And yet that's not what we see. The brain looks remarkably dormant, and yet people are having the most mind-blowing experiences, vivid experiences of their lifetime. And it's because I think it's the exact opposite, that we drop out of the default mode. The usual monkey mind has gone offline. And on these psychedelic journeys, we are actually, and same thing happens in shamanic kind of cultures, right? With ayahuasca and things, where you're actually then again dropping into the larger reality that is beneath all of the sort of like surface layer that we usually dwell in. So some of those techniques also help you experience some of the broader reality. But again, I just want to reiterate that it's more about what you can get out of the way to see what's already there beneath that, rather than trying to go somewhere else. It's already there. Everything's within you. It's about how do you access it.
That's great. And I'll insert all medical caveats apply in those statements as well. So,
yes. Make your own decisions. We're not lobbying for
exactly.
anything.
Little frames that are culpable for what you're doing with your body. So a follow-up question to that: do you meditate daily, and if so, how long?
Yes.
What's your practice there? Okay.
I do it daily, and again, I'm thankful that I am in a season of life where my kids are grown, and I know that when people have younger kids, it can be like a full-time job. Just trying to balance all that. So people have a hard time finding time. I'm blessed in the sense that I have time to do that. So I usually meditate a couple hours a day, usually like an hour and a half in the evening before I go to sleep. And then usually like half an hour in the morning when I first wake up, just sort of set the intention for the day and the right kind of resonance for the day. And one thing I really want to impress upon people is that I kind of already hinted at this, but I really want to say that it's not just about because I've had experiences with these other intelligences through meditation, but you can qualitatively make your life so much better regardless of what other intelligences you reach, because what meditation helps you do is drop out of that monkey mind. And the irony is that monkey mind is running so nonstop that we don't even notice it anymore. It's become the pair of glasses we're wearing that we don't even see. And when you finally have an experience of that monkey mind stopping, and suddenly your brain running off into the future and the past and worrying about this and thinking about that, regretting this, and suddenly you just are in the moment, right? This is what Eckhart Tolle called the power of now, right? Like you're in the moment, here and now. And Buddhists talk about this, right? You're in this moment where suddenly everything feels perfect because you tune into that collective consciousness, that non-dual base reality where everything is perfect. It's just that oneness that can't go wrong because it's this absolute core behind everything. And you can rest in that, and you feel so much vital energy come into you when you do that, because you suddenly are not this creature bound by linear time, right? And that's the first step in sometimes beginning to be able to have these alternate state experiences, because you're actually, in the same way that when you make repeated decisions and have habits, right, that actually will form canals in your brain that actually can see. If you have a repeated pattern you've done over and over and over again, then you can actually see it in someone's brain imprints eventually, right? Which kind of synaptic connections fire in their brain, right? But by the same token, when they look at the brain of long-term meditators, they see a qualitative difference, and a quantitative difference in the brain scans of these people. And I think there's even a podcast called something like, 10% or something like that, something to that effect, where basically it's talking about that regardless of who you are, if you can bring meditation into your daily practice, it'll make your life 10% better. It's almost like this, like guaranteed, like promissory note that comes with it. And so again, I would just encourage people, even if you run into difficulties, if it feels like you just have an active brain, you can't do it, I would just say keep at it. Maybe join a meditation group, or a Buddhist Sangha or something, where you can actually have other people help you, because sometimes you pick up in the coherent field and that helps you entrain your brain. But there's so many benefits that come from it beyond being able to connect to other forms of consciousness.
Well, and that's related to the last question we had here on meditation, and I would say before I pose this that meditation is, a way that we can have an embodied experience of the non-dual. We can tap into that non-dual reality. This question is asking how can what tips could you provide in order to connect to the higher intelligences? And I guess before you address that, my thought on reading that question is it relates to intention, and relates to this. What is it that you are seeking when you're asking that kind of question? What is it that you want? Because I could be reading it into this in a totally different direction than how it was intended. But I think oftentimes in the circles that we traffic, there's a lot of desire to know and to connect with these beings and attach to whatever it is that they know, so that we can have knowledge, greater insight, power, whatever it is. And that's, I don't get the sense from you that that's kind of the right intention to have, the right reason for connection. And also in the sense that we probably need to stop thinking of these other intelligences as distinctly other than, right? So there is, at this base level that we've been talking about here, we're fundamentally connected. We are basically the same. There are aspects of us that we aren't normally aware of, but they are a part of us, and we can tap into what they know and their experience of that deeper conscious field. But it's not, I just want to meditate so I can get some sort of nugget of whatever it is from this entity, from this alternate dimension. But I don't know. What would you say about that?
Yeah, that's right on. And I would say that, just to make this clear to people, I mean, I've been meditating for about 15 years. So I went a long time before there was any kind of connection with some sort of alternate intelligence. And for a long time, the reward was that experience of the power of now, that experience of really experientially and somatically, not just in my mind, but throughout my body, right? It's a fully embodied experience of non-duality. Of when you can experience that, it's incredibly peaceful, because you not only do you feel the peace in real time, but again, it's that direct knowing. It's not a conceptual knowing. It's a direct knowing that this is something you cannot lose, right? And so you rest in it in a way that you can't rest with anything else in this lifetime, which again, Buddhism will teach you is transitory and things are constantly changing, right? But when you tap into that non-dual source, you recognize that this is this is base reality, right? And this is true, and this is something you cannot lose, indestructible, because it was never created. It's just is, right? Um, so yeah, I think I would encourage people that regardless of where you start, um, there's various things you can do that all point in the right direction that will produce different fruit, of which one of them may be that you contact other entities. But as I've said, that's complex because part of it comes down to our different, constituent background, right? In terms of who we really are and what's already part of our makeup, and it's about really being unlocking doors to other parts of ourselves, basically. So, absolutely, you're right that it's not about this clear distinction between them versus me. Sometimes that's just not the case. And in the most real sense, it can't be the case, right? Because of this non dual base reality. So, again, if you meditate, if you focus on your own energy, right? If you focus on, uh, if your goal, for instance, is to eventually commune with positive entities, the first thing you can begin doing is being aware of your own energy, right? Being aware of, because in these subtle realms, there's a reflexive nature, right, where we kind of don't realize that what we're doing is dialing certain numbers, right, when we reach out. And often, if we're not conscious of it, what's actually going on beneath the scenes is that our energy is manifesting and dialing a certain number, like attracts like, that kind of thing, right? So if you actually are unconsciously manifesting all sorts of negative energy, beware of what might pick up on the other end. And again, but I also want to say you don't have to walk around nervous about that, because the key is to begin to focus on bringing more into your self-awareness, your own energy, and begin to notice when you have this residue of negativity, sort of buzzing around you, and work on transmuting that, right? It's not about suppressing it. That never works. That just creates more shadow, and it'll come up in strange ways. Often it can come in the ways of contacting beings you don't mean to. So you really want to bring it into your metacognition so that you actually are aware of it being part of who you are right now, that energy. And then you work on transmuting it, which basically means working with it, not being afraid of it, not trying to suppress it, but you work with it, and just bring it into your awareness right away will change it right away. And then as you work with it, you can actually transmute it into a neutral or a positive energy. So again, that will make your life feel better experientially. People will notice that you seem like a more peaceful person. And as a byproduct, it'll make it much more likely that you will have contact with positive entities. So it kind of all works together. And I would say that, regardless of which modality you work on first, try to keep the whole picture in mind about who you are, your own energetic constitution, and what the implications are of that in terms of reaching out to others. And those others might be the people around you, your direct family, your coworkers, and these beings you meet sort of beyond this realm.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great segue to the next section of questions that really does relate to the others. And in fact, the first question was about, what techniques to use to protect yourself from negative entities. But before you jump into that, or take that a little bit further, because you did already address some of that. I was reminded of something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and that's that even though there are other intelligences that they themselves may have, greater mastery over, the reality that you and I experience in terms of mind over matter, or even a technological superiority to what we have as technology, doesn't necessarily mean that they have a sort of a greater level of conscious development. And they, just like human beings can be attracted to negative energies, and can be drawn to those energies and want to participate in those energy sort of streams, if you will. I can think of plenty of examples in social media where it's essentially like a dog pile, where when someone is expressing a strong negative emotion or a rage or whatever, that gets the most level of engagement. So it's like moss to a flame there, and it's very much the case that in these other modalities, there are entities that are can behave in much the same way. They can be attracted to that negative expression, the negative energy, the fear, the anger, and they can be excited by that. And so I don't know. Can you speak to that a little bit more? Because I think some folks, at least though there are those who've had experiences with negative entities, and then there are those who haven't had experiences at all, but may be wary of entering into some of these modalities for fear of running into these negative intelligences.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is part of the complexity of disclosure, right, that we've talked about before, because it's not just about what other intelligences are in our midst, but it's about how do the interactions between them and us take place, right? What are the moving parts there, right? And a big part of it is our own energetic constitution for each of us, and also entire culture groups. Speaking of conscious agents, kind of adding up to larger conscious agents, and of course, we're not taught about this in school, right? If I were to ask you which grade was the last time you took a course in, spiritual hygiene, you would say, don't remember that one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or if people think about these other beings, they reduce it to angels and demons, right? And so, to say to them that there's this infinite complexity of different kinds of beings, and thinking of polarities of good versus evil is not that helpful. What's more helpful is to think about a spiral of developing consciousness. And in the same way, you can have a you can have a sage or some sort of spiritual teacher who might have made penetrating insight into the depth of reality, right, in alternate realms, but might still kind of be a jerk, right? They may just interpersonally be very, very underdeveloped. So it's and people frequently fall for this, right? So you hear about these scandals that happen in these different spiritual movements or these different cult groups, because people think, well, if this person has this legitimate spiritual insight, they must be a good person, right? And often, sometimes they're not, because in the same way that if you're born with a silver spoon and you never had to fight for anything, often you're underdeveloped in various ways because you never had that resistance training. In the same way, if people flock around someone because of their spiritual insight, they often will have other ego issues that are never addressed because they're just surrounded by yes people who just want to hear what they have to say. So yeah, all of this really matters, and when it comes to reaching out to entities and how can you protect yourself, I think I already mentioned there's this concept called spiritual hygiene, which is basically about the same way that the analogy of you wake up and you brush your teeth and you wash your hair and the certain things you do to take care of the temple of your physical body. There's also things that you need to, on a regular basis be doing energetically, right? So I already talked about through meditation and various techniques like that, you can bring into your awareness the energies that are sort of buzzing around you, right? And then work with those energies, right? Rather than, just go, oh, I'm stuck with it, right? You can actually work with them. And it begins by recognizing, for instance, if you have a negative feeling, guilt, regret, shame, whatever it is, rather than going, I don't want to feel that because it doesn't feel good. I understand it doesn't feel good. But the good news is, if you are just with it, if you're present with it, you immediately begin to change because it's like a wavelength. And so that's all it is, right? Like we break it down into concepts, right? And so we go, listen, shame's never good. So why would I want to be with that, right? But you can actually transmute shame into something else, right? And so you first have to bring that emotion, right, which is basically an expression of an energy, into your awareness, and then you work with it and you begin to change it, right? You remind yourself of things like, I'm part of the non-dual source. I've learned this lesson here. But again, just coming at it with, or being with it is a better way to put it, with conscious energy that's a forgiving energy that's connected to source, you begin to immediately change it. And that's partly why some of these entities that are negative are kind of like these sort of viruses, on the astral plane. But a lot of people are immune to them because they don't dwell in large amounts of shame, right, and fear and regret. And so if you are already working at such a level that you don't hold on to those kind of things, those entities really can't have at you. You kind of have an immunity to it. I call it energetic immunity. So this is what comes down to, this is kind of the work we do, is to bring into our awareness what's going on with us, and then working with those energies, being with them, even if they don't feel good at first, and they will change. You really can change them just by being with them. And maybe it means like seeking out a teacher that can help you work through that if it feels too overwhelming at first. Some people, understandably, have been through some hard things that they just repress because that's the body mind's way of actually trying to keep you safe and keep you alive, is that we block out or compartmentalize these, traumatic things that happen, including, for instance, having an experience with gray aliens, right? Or it could be something that happened when we were a kid that was traumatic. And so our body mind's evolutionary response to protect us is to like blockade that, right? That experience. But the problem is, part of our vital energy is now cycling in that one little area that's now been segmented off. And that's a little bit less core energy you have, right? So you might experience that with feeling less vitality day to day, right? And a lot of people might have had that happen, decades ago. And so they don't even know what it feels like to have 100% of their energy back online. But by beginning to work with some of that energy, you transmute that energy, you pull it back into your core, and it's working for you now, rather than spiraling off like an app that's just basically just running in the background and using up memory and storage, right? So these are the kind of things you need to do. If you have some sort of outstanding conflict with someone, and that also is kind of like the spiraling energy that's just, it's sitting out there running until it gets resolved. Now, this other person that maybe you need to resolve a situation with might not be ready to meet with you, right? But you can still do everything you can to resolve your part of the energy, right? And so again, you're still transmuting energy. So these are the kind of things that we do, again, not just to make our daily lives better, not just to bring more vital energy back into our daily experience, which will feel as being a better feeling of being alive, but it also gives us protection and to some degree primes the experience in terms of who we reach out to in these other realms.
Well, let me get into some of the nitty gritty here with your particular experience with the others. I've got several little questions about that. First off, is your experience with them, your communication with them, is it two way, or is it bidirectional, or is it one way when you engage with them?
It's definitely bidirectional, but it's not necessarily like a conversation like you and I are having. It's not like that. When I say it's bidirectional, I mean that I can sort of bring up questions and they will get answered in various ways, but not often in a way that's kind of linear, like a back and forth conversation. It doesn't really work that way because time's different usually in my experience of that. But it's definitely two way. Yeah.
Well, let me ask a follow up on that. So is it that you are personifying that way of knowing, or is it actually an entity in and of itself? Like, if you understand what I'm getting at there.
Help me out a bit and what you mean by that.
So you were saying that it's not like you and I having a two-way conversation, that you might put it out there and then it might come back to you and it may return in a way that's, kind of more felt. Are you personifying how that is relayed to you, like it's coming from an entity, or is it just knowledge that is instead emanating from within? I guess these sort of distinctions are also, I recognize, pretty subjective based on our metaphysical perspective here. But
right, no, I get what you're getting at, and I think that there's definitely a sense that I have this experience sometimes of being a part of a tribe that's beyond this realm, right? And so it's like a collective consciousness that has a knowing that I can the same way that you could query Google and you get an answer, right? Is that two way? Sort of, right? It's like what and then kind of like the sense of the Akashic records, right? The sense that every experience that's ever been had is somehow recorded, right, in the cosmic memory, and different ones of us have different abilities, different capacities to access that. My experience in this sort of tribal experience of these others that I feel connected to is that I will sometimes be able to pull information from there. So I'm asking a question and querying a question and getting a response, right? Not necessarily right away, but I do get a response. But it does feel like it's coming from some collective intelligence of which I'm a part in a different realm, if that makes any kind of sense. So that does, depending again how you look at it metaphysically, that's kind of how it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's helpful. Let's see. So let me ask then about your sort of perceptual experience. Because I'm getting that. Well, I know we talked about this in other instances, so I'm curious to hear what you'll say. So, do you see that these others, or just hear them? Like, what is the extent of your perceptual awareness of them?
Right, and this is tricky to answer because whenever we try and describe an experience, we have to use language and symbols based on other people's experience so they can kind of imagine what it's like, right? And I think one thing I've become aware of is that there's times where I have an experience that I will give an approximation of what it's like, but it's really not quite like that either. Like, so for instance, let me give you a couple of examples. One happened when we were talking before we went on the air tonight. So, but let me begin with one that happened last night. I was with a small group of friends, experiencers, and we were and we were talking. And at one point, I was discussing how I'm kind of at this point where I'm making some decisions, some life decisions, right? And I recognize that there's kind of like two parts of me. Speaking of these different constitutional makeups of who we are, right? There's times where, as I grow in my awareness of this, especially over the last year, almost like cream separating, I can actually experientially feel different aspects of myself. And sometimes they will be actually a little bit at odds with each other. And so my sort of conditioned earth human self will be at odds with this other part of my background prior to this incarnation. And what ended up happening when I was trying to describe this process of making a decision to these friends last night, I overlaid over top of my vision was this sense of these two energy fields coming together, and where they met there was this kind of like interference pattern which I was seeing, and it was like it was overlaid on top of my visual field while I was looking at these friends and talking about it. But it's not exactly like that. It's not quite like, when you have two screens and you kind of blend them together when you're mixing something in Photoshop or something. It's not really like that. It was almost like another sense, which I experienced kind of visually, but it wasn't taking away from the usual visual field. It was like an additional visual field where I was seeing this energetic wavelength and this interference pattern. And then earlier on tonight, when we were talking, you brought up this thing about DNA, right? And you were talking about the shape of DNA and wondering what that represented in terms of sort of metaphysical patterning, right? And as you started talking, I had this lit up experience of fractals suddenly like spiraling out, infinitely kind of thing, which that's what my experience is like when I know something's right. I have that experience of like this brightness comes into my consciousness, and I'll see a vision that like metaphorically, conceptually is an implication of what someone's saying. And then that helps me understand not only that it's right, but how it's right. But it comes conceptually like that, right? So I'm not hearing a voice saying, yes, what this means is such and such and such. It's like I'm seeing this patterning running in real time, and I know what the pattern means, right? I have immediate ability to translate what that pattern means. And in terms of what they look like, usually they're, it's beyond form. So what'll actually happen is sometimes I'll drop into this alternate experience and I'll be seeing through the eyes of one of these beings, right? So I'm actually seeing a much broader field of vision than our usual field of vision. And this is another one of those experiences where you don't realize that our field of vision is fairly narrow, right? Because we have nothing to compare it to. But when you have this other experience of a basically 360-degree field of vision, you come back to this and you go, man, this is limited, right? And the same way that people sometimes have an NDE and they come back and they go, wow, this is a constricted experience, right? It's like that. So often I'm actually seeing through the eyes of one of these beings rather than seeing them. And I also, have this very strong sense that, they're basically beyond form. They can take form, but at that sort of like dimensional level of existence, it's kind of post space time. It's transitioned beyond space time, and so they don't need a form. So if they do it, it's usually for our sake.
That's excellent. Well, I know we've got a few minutes left here, so I'm going to transition to a couple of sort of personal questions. These are mine, and in getting into areas that we really haven't touched on, but I wanted you to respond to. So, I guess a lot has happened in your experience over the last year, several months, and I've certainly been witness to that transformation, and it's been really interesting, and I feel honored to kind of be uh, alongside you on that journey. But how do you? I wonder how you kind of contextualize the experience that you're having in light of all that you've read in the literature about other individuals throughout ufological history and paranormal history who've gone through similar kinds of experiences and have raised similar either conclusions or insights or even warnings. How do you kind of position yourself in relationship to those other individuals and groups even in the past?
Well, I think one thing I would say is that I remember this one general manager of the Sacramento Kings, of who I'm a fan of, and I used to live in Northern California and was a Kings fan, which means I suffer many, many years. But one of the things the GM said when someone asked him about player development, right? He said, at some point, you can't separate the player from the man. And what he meant was you can have certain raw talent, but who you are, your character, things like that are going to really impact how you manifest your potential. And the way that I would apply that to experiencers is, and I really want to highlight this point, because in the same way we talked about like a spiritual guru who has penetrating insight into spiritual realms might still be a jerk, might be underdeveloped morally, interpersonally, those kind of things. In the same way, just because someone's had profound experiences with the phenomenon, different elements of it, of which I really want to highlight, there are different elements. Just because they've had those experiences doesn't mean they are trustworthy necessarily, right? That you still have to look at who they are as a person. You still have to look at their character. You have to look at their flaws. You have to look at where they stand on the spiral of consciousness development. And because reality literally manifests differently depending on where you are on the spiral of consciousness. And so you could end up having, for instance, just to give you a real base example, some people can't separate their initial visceral reaction from maybe some overarching metaphysical purpose. So for instance, some people, I've run into people like this, that they just, if they have the ontological shock of seeing some of these others and they look insect-like, right? Some people just say, it was a horrible experience. Those things were horrible, right? And really, maybe they never even had a conversation or some sort of dialogue, but they just, again, are projecting their own fear states, right? So I really want to make that point that having profound experiences with the phenomenon, different elements of it, doesn't make you a prophet, doesn't make you someone who's necessarily trustworthy. And you're still going to filter those experiences through the grid of your own consciousness development. So when I think back on different people, I really pay attention to that. But I will say that when I tune into people who've had experiences with a phenomenon that I consider quite well developed in terms of consciousness, it's remarkable how similar the messages are from what I experience. And some of the best channeled material that I've come across from people who are highly conscious is remarkably consistent with what I've experienced. And I would say also, this is what's fascinating about this. When we bring in spirituality and religious history, same thing. Examples of people who maybe had a lot of fear states, they will interpret a religious experience maybe in a negative way, right? Where someone else will see it in a more purposeful way, and they'll see it from a more of a 30,000 foot view and be able to see what was their visceral reaction and what was the actual underlying message or something. So I want to suggest to people that we keep all of these things in mind. Don't assume just because someone's a prime experiencer that they are trustworthy or a great example of what it is to be a human being. Joseph Burks has talked about that. He's experienced what seems to be kind of, it comes across the board, right? You get some people who are highly developed, some people who are sort of maybe lower on the scale of moral development. So just keep that in mind when you think about the messages.
Yeah, that's there's a lot of wisdom in that, and I think we have a natural tendency in our current day and age to have a sort of reflexive response to individuals that, at least when it comes to spiritual matters, who speak with a lot of certainty or authority. We've been pretty well conditioned to push back against those individuals because we've seen so many examples in our modern history of abuse that has occurred from those who have been in those positions and have gained a following and have gained power as a result of that following. So I think, and you would echo this, that it's smart to be, sort of cautious, to be aware, to be tuned in, to understand the motivations that people have, that you have as an individual for being drawn to whatever message it may be, and to constantly sort of be checking in with where you are in that relationship with that person or with that message or whatever it may be. That ultimately there is the journey that we take is our own, and we can be aided and guided by others who I think spark something within ourselves that catalyze a change, and a change for the better, and we can celebrate that. But at the same time, the journey, like the steps, have to be taken by ourselves, and we we owe a responsibility to ourselves to be cautious and safe, and checking in and making sure that we're going about that in a responsible, mature way, and seeking those kind of fundamental truths. But I'm sure you're aware, because you brought this up on a couple of your shows and on our show. You certainly mentioned it a few times. That people have contacted you. They've heard you say something on a show, and this was actually my experience with you too. They've heard you say something, and then they reached out to you, and this is happening a lot more and more. In fact, the frequency seems to be going up. I mean, so a couple of questions from that. One, what does that feel like? But two, if you could step outside of that experience and look at yourself and listen to what you're saying, how do you see that? Does it seem kind of weird to you?
Yeah, I think it is worthwhile to sort of think about it from those two perspectives. So, first thing I would say is, I've had an interesting transition in terms of I'm definitely more introverted by nature. So when I began my podcast almost 2 years ago now, within about a month from now, I was planning to stay anonymous and just, have a chance to sort of work out some processing about the phenomenon. Little did I know how much that would turn into direct contact with some elements of it, and therefore a really clear understanding of a direction to go and kind of like a mission that was kind of inspired by it. But as I kind of hinted at in the last show on Point of Convergence, I definitely think when I sort of came more, out of the closet in terms of showing my face, doing video interviews, attending conferences, speaking at conferences, it's like this other intelligence was waiting for that, and things the experience of sort of this channeled energy and communication and downloads went up like 100-fold after that began to take place. And so my saying yes was a big part of this, I think. And that one of the implications of that has been that for whatever reason, there's some sort of energetic resonance that seems to impact various people. And so, yeah, I've had contact from people around the world who will have these interesting synchronistic experiences of, like, basically being told that they should get in contact with me, and then we will end up talking, and there'll be some sort of further revelation that comes out of the fruit of that interaction. um, that's happened from people on the other side of the world, and people who ended up moving here and getting in contact with me and feeling like that all happened for a reason. So uh, how that feels is, it's kind of awe-inspiring. It's a great feeling to feel like you're part of some larger movement, of which you're a part, and you get to play a role in what feels like uh, a move towards moving consciousness forward, right? Moving humanity forward, actually finding ways to live life differently in every aspect of life. So that's what it feels like. That's a great feeling. There's nothing like feeling vitally, purposefully alive, right? That's what it really comes down to. At the same time, I recognize if I were to step back and even like have a conversation with myself from 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, I would have had a hard time believing this was going to happen, and I wouldn't know what to do with it, right? Which, again, from a Buddhist perspective, that's part of the irony, is that when we lament losing who we are, the truth is we're constantly shifting who we are, right? And so everything's in transition, including who we really are, especially if we're paying attention to the lessons we're supposed to be learning. We should be different people than we were 5 years ago, and we should be actually experiencing reality differently. That's the goal, not just between iterations, but also within an iteration. So yeah, I recognize that I might have been a skeptic of myself. So a former Darren would have been a skeptic of Darren of present time, which is an interesting thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for speaking to that. Well, let's spend a few more minutes here. Maybe we'll go over just by a tad on what our usual runtime is, because I think this next question is quite a big one. So this listener asks, "What's the end game? I have agreed with all of your conclusions in the last few podcasts, and in many ways have felt that I've already woken up to these somehow to these kinds of downloads. I've been moved to tell people about this, but what's the big picture? Is this how disclosure happens? I heard you reference a lot of people were contacting you, so is this the kind of thing going on everywhere? And if so, where does it lead? And understanding from all of humanity that we are more than our physical bodies, and then does that lead to something like the law of one material?" So lots of questions here from this listener, but I think the big one here overall is, where is this going?
Right. So I'll say a few things about that. And I kind of touched on this in the Point of Convergence podcast on the weekend. And that is, absolutely, there are, again, an implication of non-duality is that for beings that are at a high level of consciousness, their sphere of concern naturally extends towards every expression of sentient life throughout the cosmos, in the same way that would not randomly cut your arm off, or you'd be concerned if your arm was sitting next to a buzzsaw. The same way these beings are concerned if we are sitting on nuclear weapons that could wipe us off the planet and destroy a huge part of the biosphere. So it's just a natural implication of a non-dual realization, is that sphere of concern extends, and those beings exist, and they're trying to help us. But there's a respect for where we are in the process, and as we've touched on in previous podcast episodes, it's more important that we understand on our own why having nuclear weapons and bioweapons and being so adversarial towards each other it's good for us to learn those lessons on our own, not be told them by some higher intelligence, whether it's alien life or what we perceive as a god or a deity, but for us ourselves to step into the progress of evolution, consciousness development, and recognize on our own that those are not good things. So when we reach out with the right intention, they are ready to help us make those steps, but they really want us to be the ones making it. They don't want to be the parents doing the homework for you, kind of thing, to use sort of like a crude analogy, right? I mean, because again, this lifetime, as we've discussed before, is not all that matters. It's not. It does matter, but it's not what ultimately matters. What ultimately matters is how we progress as individual consciousnesses and how we progress as kind of a planetary consciousness as well, in terms of the combination of conscious agents. And so that's what they're interested in. But again, they're not going to solve our problems for us. They're not going to show up and say, hey, we hear you have global warming issues. We hear you have, problems with nuclear weapons. They will assist and even psychically influence us when we reach out with the right intention. And many people who have been inspired with various solutions to things, I think, are actually channeling some of this stuff. But again, those ones exist, but at the same time, there are many, many others that exist as well who are not as high on that consciousness spiral. And there really is, it sort of covers the gamut, right? So when people want to paint these others, in terms of, are they good or are they evil? Can we trust them or not? I'm like, well, use common sense, right? The same way that you sign a contract for someone to do work on your house. Yes, you want to assume the best, but you're also going to check their history, right? You're going to look at the work they do. You're going to see what kind of vibe they give you. Basic common sense needs to be applied here as well. So be a part of the solution. Recognize that we need to be the change we're seeking, and these others know that too. The most consciously advanced ones do. And stepping into our destiny so that ultimately we, those of us who are sort of ready to step into that next level of understanding of the connectedness of all sentient life, and our connection to the earth and everything, recognizing that everything has inherent value, that everything that shows up as a physical manifestation in this reality also has an underlying energetic kind of spiritual value to it as well, including the earth. That moving forward with that understanding, changing how we live is really what the end game is in terms of what I feel inspired to do. And in terms of what the overall, sort of geopolitical spectrum of the cosmos is, I think that there's, just like there are here, there's all sorts of different levels of consciousness on the spiral that are working their will based on their current understanding. And like you pointed out earlier, they can be technologically more advanced than us, some of them, but not necessarily morally more advanced, or they can still mostly be in self-service, or some of them can even be convinced that they're doing the right thing, but it's still based on a less than complete understanding of non-duality. And so it's going to be a partial understanding that still can kind of be self-serving, the same way we can sometimes run into that interaction with human beings and other human groups. So again, apply common sense, just like you shouldn't join a spiritual movement and assume that the leader is advanced in all these areas. If you are in contact with a group of others or an individual being, basic tests, basic common sense applies across the board.
What I appreciate about it is it has a great deal of complexity, but also there's a resonant truth to looking at reality in this way. And I also think that it provides a tremendous amount of value. It imbues experience with value. That experience itself is connoted with value and meaning. And that is incredibly important in a world that we inhabit now, where so much of what is happening around us and the way in which we're taught to look at the world and our own lives and experience, that so much of this doesn't matter at all. But when you look at it from this different perspective, the value is in each experience. Each experience is an opportunity for growth and novelty and learning and wisdom. And to not take those opportunities and to discard them or say that they don't matter, like that does a disservice not only to our iteration of this experience, but to the experience of the larger cosmos, like that we are all part of this grand play story, and every part, every piece, every set, everything that goes into that story has value and adds to the power of what that ultimately becomes, because it is in a state of becoming. And I think, to my experience of it and awareness of it, that process does not end. That becoming is infinite. There's always new layers and depth and breadth to that reality, and it's seeking that. And so that to me is a story worth telling and celebrating and being part of. And I think that's why I resonate so strongly with this way of looking at it. And it's also why the more I've gotten into it myself, the less I've been interested in some of the kind of technicalities of the UFO craft or the beings, because when you understand this concept, those things in some ways can feel quite trivial to the larger questions and picture.
Absolutely. I think there's several revelations that impact, what really is of import when it comes to the UFO phenomenon. And like you point towards, and I've mentioned this before as well, being fascinated with the craft only takes you so far. For number one, these beings, many of them are sort of vibrating at dimensional levels where they can manifest any kind of physicality uh, on the spot. And so getting caught up in the functionality kind of misses the point, and what's much more important is who's behind the craft, right? Piloting it, or, remotely controlling it or whatever. But yeah, in the same way, I think one assumption that people make that we've kind of grown up with, partly in science fiction and partly just what we were taught in science class, we have been led to believe that alien intelligences would be nothing like us, right? And they would think nothing like us. And, their understanding of morality, we might be like ants to them and they just wipe us off, and like you hear those kind of things all the time, right? You hear these notions of it's a prison planet, or we're just, cattle to them, and all these kind of things. And in a lot of ways, we're reflecting our own consciousness and our own shadow back on ourselves when we think that way, because we do that to other species, which there's a lesson in that in itself. But I think one of the revelations I've definitely had in my experiences is that this consciousness spiral applies to all sentient life, right? So they are going through the same progress as we are and are somewhere on that spiral, some higher than others. And it's not about trying to say one is better than the other. That's really the wrong way to look at it. You get as many iterations as you need to learn the lessons, right? So it's not about helping Johnny with his homework so he finally gets out of high school, because then what's Johnny going to do when he has to live his life, right? He suddenly doesn't have the tools. So the important thing is to learn the lessons we're here to learn. And these others are on that same path. And that's why it's strange to me when people don't think about just common sense questions about who these others are, not just in terms of are they good or are they bad, but even when they think they're being good. There are some people we know in the world that might have a very kind of constricting religious perspective, right? A fairly fundamentalist one. And they believe they're doing the right thing, right? They believe to their core sometimes that this is what God wants them to do, right? And we might look at it and see it as partial. We might see that they still have kind of a tribal mentality, right? That whether you look at fundamentalist Islam or fundamentalist Christianity, right? It's remarkably similar. It's like two sides of the same coin. And it says more about that level of consciousness than it does about either religion, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you could have a very progressive Christian or a very progressive Muslim, right? Who really has this kind of universal sense of everything being connected and loving everyone, right? And never wanting to harm anyone. So that applies here too. That these beings, it's not just about whether they're good or bad, or whether they even project themselves as good or bad. It's also about what is their level of self-awareness, what is self-evident truth looks different at every stage of consciousness, right? And that's not just true for human beings, it's also true for these others too. And that's why the best way we can have the most discernment about what's going on and who we're interacting with, rather than being overwhelmed by, I could be being duped, right? That kind of thing. I often get that kind of question. How do you know you're not being duped? Well, you have to develop your own consciousness to the point where you are able to discern those differences, that you have a subtle awareness where you can pick up on that. And then you ask the same questions about self evident truths based on that level of consciousness.
So well said. Well, the DNA of this show of Liminal Frames is to celebrate the exploration of these kinds of ideas and of the journey of discovery. And it's been quite a journey so far this year, and we're not done yet. So there's still episodes left in the tank here before the end of 2022, and I know we're both looking forward to what 2023 will bring. This has been an enjoyable episode, responding to these questions and giving you a chance to expound on your perspective. I have very much enjoyed uh, your insights and your willingness to be challenged by these questions and by my own questions. Our journeys are joined, but are also distinct and quite different. And we talk about that a good bit, and maybe we'll dig into some of that a little bit more in the future with our listeners. And we're so grateful for everybody who submitted questions, and those of you who had questions that we couldn't get to, we do apologize. Please keep sending them our way, and we'll, I'm sure, do another episode like this in the future. So I want to thank everybody for joining us in this time. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.